main reason we're here, what are we seeing from classes of business? What are some different characteristics? When I was looking at some of these organizations and I was kind of assessing this time and what it looked like, it's tough at the end of the day, but I was reminded of all people of Mr. Rogers and a quote that he had, which some of you may be familiar with, but basically in times of despair and in times of disaster, look for the helpers. And I think that's really relevant right now because we are in a tough time, but there are a lot of helpers, and where there is need, there are people, there are organizations that are willing to help, that are going to step up, and that creates opportunities. So just because there's all this stuff going on doesn't mean that there is an opportunity out there. First class of business that we've seen an increase for, food services. So this is probably the baseline need for anybody out there to survive, is where they're going to get their next meal and how they're going to get groceries and how they're going to feed them and their families. This class of business is really those food banks, the food pantries, soup kitchen, Meals on Wheels programs. The main exposure is food services. So I'm not going to go through all these statistics here, but as you can imagine, and I'm sure as you've heard, there's tens of millions of people that are unemployed. I saw a statistic out there that showed almost 19%, estimates up to 19% in April. Thank God that number has now gone down a little bit to about 13%, but that still means 1 in 7 people in the labor force can't find a job. So unfortunately, this has also impacted those that were already struggling even before this. It's impacted the at-risk and the low-income families and population more so than ever. So what these numbers also don't tell you are the amount of people whose income has dropped. I think a lot of it can, especially in the sales industry, a lot of people can relate to that part of it, where the income and the hours maybe even have been reduced. So even you add that whole group of population into all these statistics, and you can just see the amount of demand that there is for individuals looking for help and looking for resources. So there's just a strong sense of need, and there's a strong sense of reliance on these organizations to literally survive. So these organizations are stepping up to try to meet that need. So I think it goes without saying that food services are one of the biggest areas of opportunity, the areas of need in the industry. Next thing we'll talk about is mental health services. So again, even before the pandemic and before everything that was going on, we saw a huge need and a huge population that was really struggling with mental health issues. Really, primarily, the organizations that are stepping up here are going to be your counseling groups, your counseling organizations, your peer-to-peer feedback. But these are going to be the organizations that are stepping in to try to help those tens of millions of people that are diagnosed with mental illnesses. Similarly here, a lot of different statistics, but at the end of the day, there's not only millions of people that were struggling, there are now even more people that are struggling through this time. And there's estimates that about half of the country, that over half of Americans are going to have some sort of negative mental health effect due to what's been going on. So as you can imagine, organizations are stepping up, especially with virtual and telehealth. We can definitely consider those. Again, if it's more of like a regional-based organization where they're really just trying to find a way to meet the gap in between and meet that need for the temporary short term, while maybe some of their offices aren't open, we can still consider those that are doing those telehealth and virtual sessions. So just keep your eyes out for these, because these are also organizations that are stepping in even before COVID-19, and now especially that it's happened, a lot of people are really struggling out there. So these organizations are really stepping up. Residential services, another a big class of business or industry that we're seeing an increased demand for. Again, before the pandemic, there was still a lot of demand. About 550,000 people in the country were homeless, and that number is only increasing as people look for temporary help. So these organizations typically look like your halfway houses, transitional shelters, adult shelters, families that are looking to find their next place where they're going to get some shelter over their heads. So, these organizations are stepping up in light of the pandemic because they're going to have to meet that temporary need. So there's estimates that hundreds of thousands of beds are going to be needed to be created, or even just to comply with CDC guidelines and social distancing guidelines. Existing organizations, I think as insurance professionals, we can all attest to the difficulty in trying to keep up with those guidelines and try to help and educate and consult with our customers and the insureds to try to help them through this time. But that's similar to what these organizations are going through, because they're having to create new shelters, create new beds. There's billions of dollars that's going to have to be poured into these organizations in this industry, to keep up with the demand. So, and then there's another whole part of this, which is those that are dealing with substance abuse, which again was already a big deal before this. But there's about 20 million people in our country that are dealing with substance abuse issues, and so this only exacerbates that problem as well. And these individuals are looking for a safe place, looking for a safe haven to go to, even from an overnight standpoint, 24/7 care, where they can get those resources that they need. So again, huge demand for these organizations as these families and these individuals are really looking for emergency shelter while they're just struggling to make ends meet. The next big class of business, so those were all organizations that were really providing a direct services, those direct social human services. This product is really about the charitable part of it. So there is a fundraising aspect. Now, a lot of those organizations do their own fundraising. They do raise their own money. However, there are organizations set up specifically just purely to provide the funding and the resources needed for those organizations to continue to operate. Those look like your foundations, some booster clubs, your support organizations, fundraising groups. Primary exposure here, and if you've heard any of us before in the past talk to any of these types of products, these are really like your blanket events. So the ones that have a ton of events that they're hosting throughout the year to fundraise, and then they use those funds and they use those resources then to give back to the community, or to give back again to those organizations we discussed about earlier. Contrary to what you may believe, at least especially for me, I thought for sure people were not donating as much as they were. Actually, statistics are showing that about 3/4 of Americans are either maintaining their giving levels or they're increasing the amount they're giving. There's also incentives through the CARES Act, just to increase the incentive for individuals and corporations and companies to continue to donate and continue to be a resource to give to these organizations, to be a conduit to then provide that funding to the social human service organizations and other organizations too, not just the ones we discussed, but really any organization out there that's really looking for help. So there's a huge demand for these charitable organizations at this time. So what does this kind of look like? So we went through some of those themes and classes that we're seeing an increased demand for. What does that look like, from an actual case-by-case, risk-by-risk basis? It's really difficult to, say there's one organization that fits under this, or there's one organization that fits here. It probably looks very different, from your perspective than it does from USLI's perspective, as far as how these may be handled. You may have them, like maybe a residential portion may be in like the habitational dwelling department. You may have counseling organizations and allied health. It may look a lot different, but this is just how USLI generally classifies our nonprofit social services. And it just puts a face to the name, kind of illustrates what we're looking at here. So as you can see, there's over 1 million types of these organizations in the country, growing at 5% annually before this. We're seeing an even increased demand in current operations for those that are existing, and then those that are getting into the industry just to create a place or create an organization to help out those that are already struggling to meet the demand and keep up with the demand. So something I like to just throw out here, just so you have some perspective on it, there's about 200,000 fast food restaurants, and there's about 55,000 specialty coffee shops. So that just gives you perspective. As you can see that those numbers pale in comparison to the amount of organizations that are out there that we classify under this umbrella of social services. So massive, massive amount of opportunity out there to go after. So how can you help? How can we help? How can we work together, and how can we help cover these organizations and help you all be those consultants and help ultimately just write their coverage and help them be protected. So some highlights of our coverage. These are all hopefully some information and some highlights that you have been a little bit familiar with. If not, that's why we're going through them, so we can kind of understand the different components of our coverage. So again, I mentioned earlier that we do nonprofit package, so we're really a hybrid of our P&C and our professional lines team. So we can package the GL, the property, the D&O, EPLI, E&O, abuse and molestation. We can package it all together in one package. Typically for these organizations, it will be admitted and they will be annual renewable policies. So you can see the different components on there. Again, as I mentioned, E&O and abuse and molestation. We can go up to $1 million, $3 million on the underlying for those organizations. And we have a really robust D&O and EPLI product. So we'll get into all the details on the coverage, but just so you know, that's what we can offer for these types of risks. As far as the features, they are separate limits. We're not only providing that package coverage, but if you have sometimes aesthetically on the quotes, it looks a little bit different. So if you have questions on the different limits that are available, please look through the quote, but then you can call us or call me directly and I can help explain that. One of the biggest components of our products, not just from social services, not just from the charities, but really all of our nonprofit policies, is that we do have the blanket event coverage. So there's not going to be a premises limitation on the policy, and they're going to have coverage for all their events. Really doesn't make sense for these organizations that are out there in the community helping others, to stick them to one location. Now, there are obviously situations where we just provide the office space, the premises liability. There are instances where that makes sense, but for the vast majority of what we're going to offer, we are not sticking them to one location. They're going to have that off-premises and the blanket event coverage. Again, we have the contingent med mal or the contingent E&O. Typically, that looks like, especially for the context of what we're talking about today, that's really like your counseling organizations or social service or social workers, those kind of things that are going to need that E&O, the teachers, youth organizations, senior organizations, that kind of thing. And then just a variety of other features we've got. We have a really robust D&O and EPLI product. Hopefully you all have heard some of our features of that before, but we do offer that in the package. And again, if you want some more information on the back end, we can definitely go through them. I'd say one of the biggest things there, we include the third-party coverage, so volunteers are included. We have full prior acts, and then we have defense outside the limits, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but that's huge because that's, when we have claims, that's probably the biggest the biggest amount of payout that we have is on the defense side. So having the defense not impact the limit is a really, really nice feature. As far as the appetite and rating, so went through all those kind of different organizations as you saw earlier on that slide, kind of illustrates what those look like. Really what we rate them off of is square footage. So if you have square footage, even if they only meet in a tiny space or if they don't have a specific location, just let us know. We'll try to get that. We'll try to estimate the square footage if we can. Some of them just don't have buildings, and that's okay. But we do typically rate off square footage. Number of professionals, if you want that E&O coverage, we typically provide that without you asking, but we just want to know about how many people are providing a professional service, quote unquote. If you have 50 people in a soup kitchen and they're all volunteers, we're not going to rate on those people. But if there's one person in there that's providing mental health counseling and they're volunteering, we'll go ahead and rate for that person. So just let us know if there's anybody that acts in that capacity. And then obviously any other rating info, whether it's donated goods, meals, served, that kind of thing, we can work with you on those. But the main rating basis, square footage and number of professionals. So again, that was kind of the social service, the direct services part of it. The charities product, that's what we were discussing on that last slide a few slides ago, which was those fundraisers and those foundations. This coverage is really just thought of as more of the blanket event coverage. And again, we do have a component on some other products, but this one specifically are for the organizations that is their primary operation. So all they do really is host events. They don't really provide any service. They just are that conduit for resources. And they may have dinners or galas or luncheons or whatever it might be, networking groups, those kind of things. pretty cheap, under $400 in most states. Again, admitted annual policy. Really big deal here because, you know, you don't want to be touching these policies over and over again, especially right now when a lot of events are canceled or postponed, or they don't know when they're going to have it. If they've got a USLI policy, they wouldn't have to worry about, or especially you wouldn't have to worry about touching it 100 times. That'll just be on the books, and then whenever they have the event, it'll be covered. So annual renewable admitted policy, you know, real big benefit there, especially during this time. We do have the option to do blanket liquor coverage. So for organizations, you know, again, like fundraisers or chambers of commerce, for example, you know, networking groups where they're having mixers and that kind of thing, it may come to you as just a single event. They're looking for liquor, they're looking for GL, but we can actually put that on the annual policy and get them covered the whole year. We do include the host liquor on that as well, not just the commercial liquor, and then we can include abuse and molestation and some other coverages as well. And we can package that with the D&O. Sometimes those come in and it's just the D&O coverage. They're also just looking for coverage for their board. We can do that on a monoline basis, but we can also add this blanket event component, and it may make a lot of sense for them. Look at that. From a nonprofit perspective, so, you know, the main, I'd say probably the main thing right now, the main service is to help companies that don't really have like an HR or payroll department to kind of understand how to navigate this, especially with employment decisions. You know, that's why we have the EPLI coverage on there, but, you know, we also want to make sure that organizations are understanding how to, you know, navigate a certain situation and how to, you know, properly operate their business, I guess, at the end of the day, you know, just to really make sure that they're understanding all the resources available to them and how they should be going about the decision-making in their organization. Because again, a lot of these organizations don't necessarily have a robust HR department. So that's one of the biggest things that's going to be offered through this. And there's discounted background checks and that kind of thing on there too. So just take a look at bizresourcecenter.com. Let us know if you have any questions on that, and we can help you with those different services.